A new push by the United Nations to bring together rivals in Libya. It's been chaotic and uncontrollable for 6 years since the fall of former strongman Muammar Gaddafi. Is the UN able to achieve peace? And how are regional rivalries complicating the situation? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sohail Rahman and welcome to the programme. The downfall and death of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 was hailed as a victory for democracy by some in the international community. Since then, Libyans have suffered 6 years of war, chaos and competing governments. The power struggle between rival factions and militia has also allowed ISIL to expand its influence. So lots to sort out for the newly appointed UN Envoy to Libya. Ghassan Salama arrived for a surprise visit to Misrata on Tuesday. From the city, here's our Libya reporter Mahmoud Abdelwahid.
In his first visit to the Libyan city of Misrata as UN Special Envoy, Ghassan Salama received a warm welcome. He met with the city's political leaders about divisions in the country. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi 6 years ago, Libya has been mired in conflict with rival militias battling for control.
My main role is to listen to as many Libyans as possible, with no exceptions, because the United Nations is keen to maintain the unity, independence and interests of Libya and not to let any other country intervene in Libyan internal affairs.
Leaders in Misrata want the UN to put pressure on a rival parliament based in the eastern city of Tobruk to accept the UN-sponsored Libyan political agreement.
We
ask Mr. Salama to intensify his efforts with Libyan rivals in order to reach a solution to the tension among them, especially in regard to the controversial articles of the Libyan political agreement.
The UN Special Envoy to Libya, Ghassan Salama, wants us to speak to all the rivals and listen to a significant number of other Libyans. But many say he can only succeed in ending the crisis by bringing all these parties together within a comprehensive political settlement.
Salama has a difficult task on his hands. Despite a political agreement signed in Morocco in 2015 and another agreement in Paris last month between UN-backed Prime Minister Fayez Sarraj and renegade General Khalifa Haftar, the relationship between Libya's rival leaders is steeped in distrust. Mahmoud Abdelwahid, Jazeera, Misrata.
It's a complicated situation in Libya, and here's why. There are two power centres. The UN-backed government of National Accord, or the GNA, is in the capital Tripoli, headed by Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj. He's supported by a loose coalition of armed groups in western Libya, but struggles to impose his authority. Then there's the Libyan National Army, or the LNA, led by Khalifa Haftar. The renegade general was a Gaddafi loyalist who then helped topple Libya's longtime leader. The LNA controls territory in the oil-rich east, including what's known as the Oil Crescent. It refuses to recognise its GNA rival in Tripoli. Instead, it allies itself to a government known as the House of Representatives based in Tobruk. Sarraj and Haftar failed on a power-sharing compromise when they met for the first time for talks in May. Let's bring in our guests for this edition of Inside Story. From London, we have Analyst Gomati, Libyan political analyst and founder of the Tripoli-based Sadeq Institute. Joining me also from Moscow is Alexey Kh-leb-nikov. He's a Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. And also in London is George Joffe, who lectures in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Mr. Gomati, can I start with you, please? In London, a new man, a new way of thinking. Does Ghassan Salama have what it takes to make headway in a dispute that's lasted, what, nearly 6 years?
Well, he certainly has a hefty task in front of him, and his mandate, as he said very earlier this week in Misrata, was that he wanted an inclusive deal, but he also wanted a deal that moved away from the interference from the international community. Now, that's a very difficult mandate indeed, and it raises several questions. And the first, obviously, is are the local actors, those that are going to be involved in this unity government, are they ripe for peace? And I think if we listen to some of the statements that Khalifa Haftar made earlier last week, 10 days ago, I think in Paris, he's already claimed that he wants to have a mandate away from the government to continue to fight terrorism. He has the ownership and the monopoly on the definition of the word terrorism, and he's already indicated that members of the Government of National Accord, those colleagues of Fayez Sarraj, the Prime Minister, the President of the UN-backed government, he's labelled them Al-Qaeda and ISIS sympathizers and extreme Muslim Brotherhood members. And the second point, obviously, regards to the international community's role, is does the deal in Libya work for regional backers of the local actors on the ground? And that means, does an inclusive deal work for them? And I think I would hesitate to say that it does. In fact, for Khalifa Haftar's backers, they don't believe in an inclusive deal, and neither does Khalifa Haftar. He wants to have a deal that gives him absolute political autonomy. He wants to have military control, commander control over all armed forces there, and he wants to have financial independence away from the government so that he's able to source funds for whatever purpose that he has. Indeed. Now, that doesn't sound like someone that wants to share power, and it doesn't sound like someone that is ready for peace. Okay. So it hesitates and it begs the question, how do you induce peace? How do you get those actors ready around? And if Ghassan Salama doesn't have the ability to use both a carrot and a stick, and that stick to reprimand actors that either go beyond the pale or do too much or incite violence or continue the war by other means, then how can we call this a government of national accord or a unity government or a final destination of peace? It looks quite the opposite. It looks like it's a journey within the war for
okay,
total
let me bring in
Mr.
Gomati. Let me bring in Mr. Joffe here, because I think you've really set the stage for us here. Mr. Joffe, you obviously heard what Anas had to say also in London. It seems very much that certainly from one side of the political spectrum, one man's politician is also another man's terrorist, and trying to get people to the table to talk and acknowledge each other as partners in peace and partners for a future in Libya on the front of politics is going to be very difficult for the new UN envoy.
Well, the fact is that we've not really advanced from 2014, when the same issues arose, the same divisions existed, they just simply weren't quite so clear-cut. Now, it's true that the United Nations did arrange the Libyan political agreement, and that seemed as the way forward. But that's now been discredited by a large number of the actors inside Libya itself, and it's very difficult to see how someone in the position of Khalifa Haftar, who is now a dominant military force inside the country, can be persuaded to join in. He's rejected the idea of coming under the Government of National Accord. He, in fact, regards them not only as being a danger, but as being competitors. And in those circumstances, it seems to me, it's going to be very difficult to resist him. And yet he insists that he should be seen as the sole embodiment of military power inside Libya. That's not going to be acceptable to Misrata. It's not going to be acceptable to the militias inside Tripoli. It will be acceptable to those in Zantan. But otherwise, I'm afraid the struggle is going to continue.
If that's the case, then well, you've laid the groundwork for us there in terms of this programme. Let's bring in Alexey Kh-leb-nikov, because while we talk about the domestic work that has to be done within Libya, there is an international perspective, obviously, to this. We saw a ceasefire agreed in France just last month. We saw the initial talks between Sarraj and Haftar break down in May earlier this year. Russia is also very keenly interested in finding a way forward. Just give us an impression of how you see the Russian perspective. They were an ally of Libya during the Cold War under Gaddafi. What's their position right now?
Well, firstly, we should start with that Russia has a genuine interest in helping to find, assisting to find diplomatic political solution to the Libyan crisis. Secondly, we should talk about the restoration of Russia's lost contracts which were agreed during Gaddafi time. So basically those are economic contracts on construction of railways, electrification of the country, some oil contracts, which one of them recently was also signed between Rosneft and Libyan National Petroleum Company. So these are the major rationales behind Russia's active so to say, mediator's role.
Is that why they've welcomed? Is that why they've welcomed? Sorry, Mr. Kh-leb-nikov. Is that why they've welcomed General Haftar to Moscow on more than one occasion? Do they really see him as the way forward, rather than the weak government that's led by Sarraj?
Well, I wouldn't go that far saying that Russia is betting on Haftar as the next Libyan strongman. Definitely, Russia sees Haftar as a part of the future, of the Libyan future, as he controls quite strong army and military, and he enjoys financial and military support of Egypt and United Arab Emirates. So definitely Russia wants Haftar to be a part of the future in Libya. But it is not to say that Russia refuses to acknowledge Sarraj. Basically, Russia invited Sarraj to Moscow with Haftar this week, but only Haftar arrived. And Sarraj was in Moscow this spring, I believe.
Okay.
And basically, Russia also exploring opportunities to create the platform in Moscow, so Sarraj and Haftar can sit together and discuss things like they did in Paris.
Okay, Mr. Gomati, let me come back to you in London. We've obviously seen an international dimension of potential peace talks or negotiations, but also we're looking at agreements that have been signed. There was the LPA agreement of 2015 signed in Morocco, which was perhaps a document, a way forward, a roadmap to try and find peace in Libya. The ground realities have changed even from 2015 onwards. So are there issues with the agreement as to whether even that can be implemented and the stakeholders can move forward?
Well, I think it still comes back to this main point that the local actors, those stakeholders that are invested in the GNA process, have also got regional backers. Now, Khalifa Haftar is one of those individuals that has regional backers, not only in the Arab world, but also Russia. So I would hesitate to accept the definition by Alexey. I would also say that militarily speaking, Russia and its defender, its naval force that was on the coast of Libya only several months ago, that welcomed Haftar onto the naval base and also allowed talks to discuss about docking rights in Benghazi. They discussed further movements and incursions into whether or not they could have a potential military presence within Libya. So I think the role of international actors also has to be a vital component of this. Now, you can also divide that up into whether or not local actors and international actors, do they believe in an inclusive civil-led government or a monopolized government, a military government or a military state? And I would say that the backers of Khalifa Haftar, those that enjoy the closest relationship to him, have that reasoning in their mind. They want to see a monopolized state under Haftar. And I think the reasons for that is, particularly in the Arab world, you have some states that find that pluralism and inclusive government that changes hands from one actor to the other, left or right, Islamist, secular, and all those shades in between, that is an existential threat for many of the countries in the Arab world that have felt a threat from this kind of transition since 2011. So Haftar, unfortunately, is not only an actor inside Libya, he's an actor in the broader regional war, and Libya is caught up in this big ideological war that is happening all over the Arab world. And we're just, unfortunately, when we're speaking to many of the local actors, you don't know whether or not he has the autonomy to sign. So Khalifa Haftar may have joined into the talks in Paris later last week, but then he has to go to Moscow, then he has to go to Cairo, and he has to go to Abu Dhabi, and he has to discuss with his backers as well whether or not that deal works for them and what kind of form of a deal they want. So I think ultimately, I don't think it's as clear-cut as saying whether or not the LPA is just a document that is going to be agreed upon by Libyans. It also has to be agreed upon by the internationals, and that's the irony of today's war, is that the less visible side is happening in Cairo, it's happening in Moscow, it's happening in Abu Dhabi, it's happening in Paris. It's not always happening in Tripoli or Tunis or Misrata or Algiers.
Of course, George Joffrey is also nodding in agreement, because then it really does boil down to the work that the new UN envoy can actually, or what he can actually achieve. And as Anissa said also in London, it's all about the stakeholders. You know, it's about the influence of the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia, France, and Italy as well. In terms of a final solution and a final settlement, Mr. Joffrey, at the end of the day, these stakeholders all have to have really the backing of the UN, do they not, to make Libya the legitimate country that it should have been for many, many years?
Well, that would be nice if it were true, but I don't think it is. The United Nations, in a sense, is a marginal player at the moment. Yes, it's created the Government of National Accord, but that government hardly exists inside Tripoli itself. It's even contested by a shadow government there too. In effect, Mr. Haftar is in a position where he has got powerful backing. He's got control of a large part of Libya. He controls the oil sector, and that's really crucial because that's what pays for the war that goes on. And in those circumstances, it seems to me his own regional backers probably are more significant than the backers inside the United Nations. Beyond that too, European powers are getting extremely tired, particularly Italy, of the implications of the chaos inside Libya, particularly the migrant flows across the Mediterranean. That means that they now want a solution at almost any cost, and they're prepared to consider, and they're beginning to consider, that maybe the solution does have to be Mr. Haftar and the government in the east. And that means they're coming into line behind the regional players in the Gulf. That's very significant. It also means they're fitting in with Egyptian preoccupations about what will happen in Libya. So I think we're looking towards some kind of resolution, but not perhaps the one that the United Nations originally anticipated or wanted.
Alexey, Kh-leb-nikov, you're nodding in agreement with what Mr. Joffrey had to say there in London. Would you like to come in there?
Well, I totally agree with that. Nobody is interested in Libya's chaos, especially it's Europe in the first place, not the United States, not Russia. And one of the most important things is this migration, influx of migrants. And this is issue not about the Haftar controlling or Sarraj controlling territory, but it's the issue of the southern tribes, so which basically grant permission of migrants, to go further into Libya's north and then cross the sea. So basically, what Russia's take on that it wants Sarraj and Haftar to come to certain common understanding of these things, and then of the position of unity to talk and negotiate with southern tribes. And Russia's point here is that it has connections and it keeps contacts with all the parties. So basically, it is inevitable in the future at one point that this situation with migrants should be resolved before something bigger can be achieved. Okay. And this is one of the major issues for Europe in the first place. And because of that, the collaboration, mutually fruitful, could be reached between Europe and Russia, or on a bilateral basis between Italy and Russia, and France and Russia, towards in Libya.
So indirectly, it could have a much larger impact if peace were found in Libya. Mr. Gomati, let me come back to you in London. I mean, and move this conversation now to the potential for elections. It's something that the stakeholders actually want, and yet in a country that seems so fractured at the moment, the first question is, could it really happen? And could it happen if would the international community accept an election result in Libya when it just seems so fractured? It seems rare that you could have a free, fair and transparent election in basically what is a war zone.
Well, that's precisely the problem, and I think there are two major issues. Let me just come back to the point that Alexey just raised regarding really what the international fear is around Libya. There are two big fears. First, the migration crisis, and the second is ISIS, or ISIL. And I think that the two major issues, when they're debated in this way, the reality is that more war is not going to be better for the migration crisis. More war is not going to be better for ISIS and the prospects for countering terrorism in Libya. So unfortunately, even if we look forward towards elections, given that we're actually talking about elections where we're in a period where for many of those actors on the ground, war looks more lucrative than peace, elections in the middle of all this chaos can also be a problem because it throws into the air many of the institutions that many of these actors take their legitimacy from, such as the House of Representatives, the Eastern-based Parliament, such as the General National Congress, the Rump Parliament in Tripoli. Now, if you have to have new actors and new relationships have to be built, it doesn't necessarily seem like it's going to be an easy route towards rebuilding those and rebuilding the legitimacy of many of those actors. Now, if many of those actors continue to want to have war, I think the real prospect is, can some of those actors, like Khalifa Haftar, who does seem like he's sending out the message that he wants to go for the elections, if Khalifa Haftar believes that he can induce a win, then he will go for it. But I don't think that many of those actors are putting all their eggs in one basket and saying, let's go through the electoral process.
Sure.
There is still the prospect for a peace because much of the appetite is still there. And if, again, many of the international actors don't necessarily think that the electoral process is in their favour, then they will continue to try and fuel or sustain the war as it is.
Indeed. Mr. Joffrey, let me expand on this, because one of the the most difficult tasks for the new UN envoy to Libya is that he has to talk to General Haftar in one particular aspect, because Haftar wants his cake and he wants to eat it. He still wants to be the head of the army. He still wants to be part of the three-man presidential council that would rule Libya post-election. And he still wants to maintain a very strong base politically and militarily. It's one thing, quite obviously, that the UN envoy has got to try and persuade him out of, to a certain extent. He's got to choose one option or another.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think General Haftar is going to be prepared to listen to the idea that he's got to make choices. He's already made it quite clear that he won't stand down as Libya's supreme military commander. Behind that stands another ambition, and that is, of course, that he will actually also be its political commander too. And so I think what we're looking at is really, in the end, an attempt to take over power and to persuade the other actors in this process that they must coincide with this view and accept his own decision. Now, in the East, that's not a problem. It's a real problem as far as Misrata is concerned, and it'll be a problem too as far as Tripoli is concerned too, where many of the militias would not be prepared to accept that. And that means that, in effect, the stalemate will continue. And I'm not certain that the United Nations is in a position to be able to resolve that. And it means, in effect, that we have a long way to go, and probably there's going to be more bloodshed, more violence, and more confrontation. And that does bring in the issue of the insecurity, particularly in the south, where ISIL is still a reality, despite its defeat in Sirte at the end of last year, and where it could very easily play a spoiler role of some considerable significance.
Well, Alexey's also nodding there in Moscow, and I just want to add, I'm sure you want to come in on what Mr. Joffrey just said, but are we looking then long-term perhaps at a military dictatorship in Libya that the actual international community approves of if General Haftar does come out on top of all of this?
So first I would like to come back to the previous remark about that UN has a little power and influence on things, especially on settlement. But I mean, my vision is that the UN should be viewed as an umbrella under which a mediator's activity is undergoing. And this is what is important, because for now, Salama is perceived by all parties as a legit negotiator. And as we already know, in his 2 weeks in his position, or 3 weeks in his position, he already met with all parties in Libya. And yesterday or 2 days ago, he visited Egypt, talking not only to the parties of the conflict, but also with their regional backers. So I wouldn't disregard UN role in this negotiation process per se. But I would also underline that without bilateral and individual attempts of major powers like France, Italy, Russia, Egypt, UAE, who are involved in one way or another in this conflict, it won't be successful. Okay. So this is why it is needed to, so to say, to find a way how to basically reconcile parties within Libya with the help of the regional backers under the umbrella of the United Nations. Right. And I think this is what is we're moving towards. Right.
Alexey, we are coming to the end of the programme. Anis, 30 seconds to the end of the programme now. We want to know from you, in terms of what the UN representative can do and what he can achieve to actually make all the stakeholders feel, yes, we're on the right track. Is there anything he can do in these first few weeks?
He has to spend as much time as possible trying to quarantine the international meddling that is happening in Libya. And I think that's primarily a political issue, but it's also a military issue, and it has to be solved diplomatically, and it has to be solved through sanctions, or at least it has to be sounded out that this is no longer acceptable, and people have to be called out, or countries have to be called out by name. And the second is that if this roadmap is to emerge for elections, and people do believe that there are going to be a result that is respected, two factors have to be reminded. The first is that this is an electoral process that has civilian oversight and an international oversight, but it's about creating a civil state. If we have actors in there that want to use this as a journey towards creating a military state, then we have to be very clear about what the implications are. And the second factor is if Mr. Khalifa Haftar makes it towards Tripoli, is that really the end of the war? I think you're going to find many actors that find this is the beginning of a new war, and the international community has to be aware of what that means for Libya, but also what it means for the region in terms of countering terrorism and also countering migration. So I think it's going to be a very long journey, but the start is symbolic at the beginning of making that clear red line that the international actors can no longer meddle in Libya's sovereign affairs.
For the moment, there we will leave it, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. To Anis Gomati in London, Alexey Kh-leb-nikov in Moscow, and George Joffe also in London. Gentlemen, thank you. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can watch it any time by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman, and the rest of the team, thanks for your time and your company.